Yeah, it is. All right. Well, oh, it came up perfectly this time. No presenter
Can you
view.
see the size full screen now? Yeah. Are we off
Yes.
and running?
Good.
Yeah.
I'm going to, well, I'll just say thank you so much to, to you, Keith, and to James for joining us today. I'm really lucky to have known Keith and James for a very long time. James and I worked in the field together probably for more than a decade now, and former colleague at the University of York, and have had the pleasure of interacting with Keith in various different ways, especially through our interest in computer applications and his work that he's done with the Archaeology Data Service over time. Yeah.
About 25 years since they began.
Gosh, okay. James is a lecturer in the Department of Archaeology at the University of York, and he co-directs the Digital Archaeology and Digital Heritage MSc programs. And Keith is an AHRC leadership fellow, and hence we're going to be hearing a bit about that, or maybe everything about that today. And in his usual day job, I guess, is based at Historic England. So I am going to stop hogging the screen, and I'll pass it over to you guys. Thank you so much for joining, and can't wait to hear more about the matrix.
Thank you, Sarah. Shall we say hello together, James? Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, I'm going to do the first part, and then James will take over about halfway through, and then I'll finish off at the end. So you can see the full screen slides, at which point then I will go over and give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about, sort of give you an introduction. Sarah's mentioned this AHRC Leadership Fellowship. I am an archaeologist. I know for some of you may know I used to dig in London. I used to, before Molar, there was something called the Department of Greater London Archaeology. I used to dig in Southwark, dug on things like the Rose Theatre and along the South Bank. But I now have a job at Historic England. I have a visiting research fellowship at the University of South Wales, and I currently am fortunate to have a research funding to do a leadership fellowship with the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and this Matrix project is really what that fellowship is funding. So I'm going to talk about this sort of archaeological process work that I've done through the Matrix. Going to talk a bit about digital data and stratigraphic standards. Then James will talk about how it relates to this work he's done at Çatalhöyük, and come on to talk a bit more about GIS. We'll be interested. We're going to flash some questions at you as we go through as well, because there's things I would really welcome having feedback from you by the end of this. I'll come back after James and talk a bit more about the specific experiences I've had during this Matrix work. I started in January 2020, just before COVID began, but then obviously the last year or more, it's all been fun and games with COVID-related things. And then I'm going to talk at the end about a specific piece of data that I've picked up, which relates to a site that was dug by Molar as part of the Crossrail work. So this XSM10 data site, which we've got from the data from ADS, and finish up hopefully with showing you an example of some software we're developing as part of the project. It's a prototype. It's not meant to be a fully functioning system, but we're interested in sort of launching it. Basically, this is the first time we've actually going to launch it to let other people play with it. We've been working on it since December, and I should mention my colleague Kerry Binding, who's not here today, but he's a computer programmer at the University of South Wales, and he is very much the person who is the wizard in Wales who has produced the software. And therefore, without further ado, just to give again overview and background, obviously what we're talking about today is based on the principles of stratigraphic recording, and those principles are pretty much enshrined by sort of Edward Harris developed in the sort of late 70s, or from the 70s onwards into the 80s, and working with very much archaeologists at the Department of Urban Archaeology, DUA, in the 80s, I think, Steve Oskins and co in particular, kind of introduced the method for what became known as single context recording. I can take it off the shelf as if by magic, it's sitting there. So obviously Harris himself has produced books. I've got those on the shelf too, and there's more now. Sort of recently, he's actually made quite a lot available through the web as well. Some of the principles of our stratigraphy are available for the free download, and that I will have to acknowledge has been very helpful even in my research work. Being able to, you'll see some of these diagrams, the one on the right, being able to just cut and paste them out of stuff from the web is by no means a small contribution to making things more openly available and promoting these principles. But having said all that, and the principles are great, and the books are great, and the method and the series are great, but then there's the sort of reality of what it means to get the stuff out of the ground. And in practice, and this is where sort of my work on this matrix research project comes in, actually it kind of derives from earlier work I did for some projects, which I'll mention a bit later on, but they were also research funded projects where we were trying to reuse data and do sort of more interoperable work across data sets across UK. So I had help from Pete Rorkslow, took data from London, took some of the poultry data, and we did work with a lot of the grey literature doing things like natural language processing, trying to search across data sets. But what we found were issues that actually, although the data offer was okay in terms of what had come off site, you might get straight sort of what I'd almost call raw strat data, above below relationships from site records. What was making it hard was that, of course, there was all the work that had gone on in terms of analysing and interpreting and synthesizing all the post-ex work, bringing in the data and things, meant that data changed, to be frank, or was analysed in post-ex, and that meant that there was more information that didn't necessarily get consistently deposited in the archive, or you might get the archive of what had happened by the end of the phasing, but then you wouldn't get the raw data stratigraphic relationships that had initiated or originally come off site. So there's this kind of mismatch, which I'll talk a bit more about in the middle of this. So my first question to you as molar archaeologists is one thing we came across, I've used this ADS, the archives on ADS, is something known as the Index of Archaeological Association, which I'm very interested in understanding how that is used, whether you use it internally or whether it's just a product of the archiving, and therefore sort of to what extent that is common practice and how you use it. So just for those who may or may not even know what I'm talking about when I talk about Index of Archaeological Association, because I've got a feeling that it's something that ends up in the archive. Is it something only molar use? I mean, I've only found it in the molar archives. Nobody else in the UK that uses this. They may have various other versions of something that might be kind of like a phasing index file. I don't know if people who've worked for Headland as well are using it. It's a simple sort of what we call a CSV, comma separated format file. And I'm just interested. It's raised questions around reuse. Is it something that people use when you go between sites? Is it and even within this Index of Archaeological Association, it's noticeable that when it's on the ADS, there is still some sort of little tweaks around the naming of some of the fields on that file, which are duplicated. Again, sort of background to a lot of the work comes from other projects. I've worked on European funded projects, something called Ariadne, where we were trying to look. I developed some methods for, as I say, doing interoperability amongst UK data sets, but then we started to think, well, how, particularly for European projects, people in Germany are digging thing called the Planum system. If any people have worked abroad, In the Middle East, there's older style of recording called locus, where they still record things by the basket of dirt rather than the single context method. Basically, anyone who's worked outside Mola will know that you go to another organization, they will have their own version of a context recording sheet. I yet to find anywhere I've worked where they simply use exactly the same sheet that's used in London. Having said that, I've been around a lot of the organizations now, and pretty much all of them, I would say, I'm not wishing to misquote people, but sort of unofficially, they've all pretty much said that they use some flavor of what came from the red manual, with meaningful or necessary adaptations according to the kind of sites they're working on and other issues. But when you try and compare data across, then it raises issues of understanding which fields in which form in which data set actually match the same things in other systems, and that's something I did across Europe as well. There are, again, digital tools. So we're going to talk a lot more about sort of potential for digital tools and how digital recording may have evolved and changed things. Again, this is one of the issues, I think, for us in the last 20 years, and James will talk more about the role of GIS and how that may have changed things. But as some of you know, that there were software tools, and there still are software tools, although again, they have raised their own issues, like Bond Matrix, Harris. Well, Bond Matrix turned to, Archaeological, then turned to Stratify. As far as I know, Stratify has not been updated since 2015 and is now, even though there is data on ADS, it's pretty much unusable unless you have an old Windows 7 machine. Harris has produced software, but again, talking to him, there were questions around that actually you have to pay for, which I think is another huge issue for people in terms of, is it cost effective to have to pay for software if depending on how much stratigraphy you've got and how complex it is, and that's another issue as to when matrices are most appropriate for use, compared to sites where you may only literally be digging out in the countryside and you've literally got top, middle, bottom, natural. You may not need to draw a matrix over and over again for each. And of course, Excel, my experience again has suggested that a lot of people are hand knitting matrices in Excel, and in fact, James will come on. I may do him a disservice here, but I think that they were using Excel at Çatalhöyük. Certainly, that's quite common. Talking with colleagues like Dougie at PCA, and you'll see some examples of Dougie's awesome hand knitting in Excel. But for me, the real driver for my project is about reuse and working with other people. Clearly, I can clearly understand why, if you're working on a site, your focus is on the site, and what you produce is all about getting that site right and maximizing the time to produce the best record for the site. And it's very hard, perhaps, sometimes to think about, what happens in 10 years' time when someone comes and digs the site next door. How will they actually want to use the data that I made 10, 15, 20 years ago? But it's important. I mean, how much, one of the questions I'm asking in my project is how much data sharing goes on between different sites across organizations, which is quite interesting in terms of the sort of network, one-to-one network. People tend to share where they know someone who works in another organization, but there's no formal way, particularly of sharing, I think, data until it's archived. Then that goes back to the questions I've already mentioned about the variability between different archives across different organizations. And that's even just at site level records. When it comes to grouping and phasing, because I'll be honest, I've yet to get anyone other than Alex Smith at Headland to send me anything that approached a manual for PostX. And they wrote something for the A14, which is pretty recent, given how long and how many sites we've done over the years. So issues of multiple forms and formats and mixed data. So that's kind of trying a very fast overview of where this project has kind of come from and is currently going. But also as part of the work, in order to go and try and work more consistently when I've visited, say, the main organisations. Obviously, I came to talk to Dave Boucher at Mola before COVID, talked to Oxford and Wessex, Chris Brain and Jill Hay, etc., etc. But in order to try and understand the commonalities between the different organisations, and I've done something called sort of process modelling, where we're trying to look at where there are commonalities in process, even if people hold different data, put different names on their data sets. There may be higher level concepts like grouping and phasing, which people are doing consistently. If we can just sort of get some commonality in what they mean in those terms. So I went round, I went round to some of the organisations, and then have been happily Zooming with people since COVID around the country, and I'm trying to identify these commonalities. So I won't try and make you read the details of this. Basically, the point here is that there's a kind of common process of you initiate a project, you excavate, you then sort of assess what you got on the excavation, you then do analysis. If you're lucky, you have the money to do analysis and publication and an archive. And one of the main points about this diagram is simply that big diamond in the middle is the top line is trying to show that there is a difference between what goes on, I think, in commercial research, commercially funded research, development-led research, compared to perhaps more what you call more traditional research funded projects. The bottom line is there is, sort of academically, you kind of go out, you dig a site, you presumably are digging a research excavation, and you're expecting to have the funding to go through the publication analysis. If you're commercial sites, that seems to be a less certain route, and often what happens around that hiatus in the middle is that the data it reaches assessment, a strat report may be written, an OASIS report may be sent to OASIS, but the question of sort of where and when the data flows through the analysis and to publication is much less straightforward, and therefore there are an awful lot of sites on ADS that have no data that's been through analysis. So just to sort of summarize that, obviously there's data that you could say it comes from the excavation at an archive level to some extent. Then data could be analyzed stratigraphically. The stratigraphic data could be published and it could be archived. But the thing I'm arguing for here is, in a sense, if you're going out to start the site, the first thing you do is actually check the archive to see if anyone's dug anything before. And so you may actually yourself need to be able to reuse some of that data at the start of a new excavation. So there's a certain sort of research cycle to this. Again, this is just another way of showing, rather than it being a linear thing where you just do a site and finish it and archive it, we need to think of a bit more of a circular research, that what you archive will be the start of somebody else's next site. Again, so without again going into all the details of the process modeling, basically this is just something that I did with James's help and Kerry in order to decide what we needed to put in the software. So our software starts in a sense that with the point that it's not necessarily designed as a tool for site, because I think most people would say a Harris matrix is already a reasonable tool for collecting site data. But we're talking more about the data that has come off site, and people may then want to use it digitally. So we might need to check the excavation data in the first case, do a series of iterative groupings, subgroupings, however you want to call it, depending on where you're working. You might do some sort of phasing and dating related, phasing work on the data, and that is dependent, I would argue, around data that's about the interpretation and actual dating evidence. So that's the sort of raw bones of what our software is trying to do. And again, rather than just sort of see it as a linear thing, we know that often it's not a straightforward process of saying, oh, I've got the date, I'm now going to phase it. Different things come in at different times. You might be waiting for a specialist report to try and date, and then it comes in late and you've got to redo the phasing because some of the dating evidence is surprising. And one of the key points is that I have a PhD student working at Sheffield on Bayesian chronological modelling, working with Professor Caitlin Buck, and we're looking at how this data, stratigraphic data, is crucial as part of the Bayesian modelling process. So that's also an aspect of my work. Fine, right. Bottom line is we are trying to kind of work towards what is the commonalities in stratigraphic data, and that inevitably then sort of draws us into the world of standards, digital standards, what CIFA standards is, what ADS considered to be good standards and good practice. But even with ADS's good practice, there's still an awful lot of variation in what people actually put into their archives. And ADS, in the end, take the archives they're given. It's not ADS's job to say what is the crucial thing that needs archiving on the site. It's down to the people who dug the site to say what is the archaeology that needs preserving. So as long as if someone says they give ADS a database in a reasonable database format, they will take that, and they're not necessarily able to say that all the data is as it should be within that archive. As I say here, also one of the real issues with sort of stratigraphic data and what I'd say the matrix data is that it's often in image format and PDFs and not in database formats or even spreadsheet formats that can be reused. And some of the work we've done has shown that it's much more advantageous if that data is in digital formats for preservation, interchange, sharing, and reuse. A good example that I would put forward is, at least in this case, is that you can see this is the Silbury Hill archive, which I will admit was an English heritage historian archive. This is a spreadsheet. It's in Excel. You can see that one of the other things we're going to do in the project, we're looking at some of these other temporal relationships that we can make use of, but that's still a spreadsheet. It's not reusable data. It's got the before, it's got the strat relations before and after and equals. But actually all that stuff with boxes and brackets and everything isn't programmable. It's not stuff that we can use and interrogate programmatically. It would have to be rekeyed all back in order for us to use it. And to do some of the things that we demonstrated, we were able to make the data interoperable if the data was in formats that we could easily use and didn't have to spend hours and hours rekeying it into a database format. I'll skip over most of this, but the bottom line is, and here's the quick slide I promised in terms of Dougie's work at PCA, and I have to say that I put up here Reality of the Horror, not in any way to criticize Dougie's. Dougie's work was fantastic, but I just have to share the pain that I couldn't believe when I asked him what those yellow lines were about. He told me that Excel could only manage something like 25,000 contexts, and after that it all crashed, and Dougie had to go back in and color in the lines again in yellow so that he knew which were the right lines, because when he re-imported it, it duplicated every line in his matrix, at which point I nearly cried. And I think at that point, my main point on this is simply the question, what will people comprehend of our archaeological archives in a few 10, 100 or 1,000 years? Anyone could guess, really. And I think at that point it's over to James.
Hi. So so this, I suppose, I don't know, I've been working very closely with Keith on all of this, just because I've got a sort of background in digital archaeology, and my PhD was on digitizing matrices and using matrices to sort of think about the sort of spatiotemporal structure and analysis of the site. And one of the things I think, Keith's highlighted this fact that there's a sort of a wide range of recording practices, even within the sort of banner of single context recording, that I'm sure you're all very familiar with, both across the globe and within the UK itself. Actually, I think if and broadly speaking, I think these are linked to two broad schools of recording, which are this sort of like, this goes back decades really in the literature. You can see literature by Harris and Roskams and that advocating sort of single context recording, and then you've got the sort of flip side of that, which is the sort of feature group approach propagated by Carver and the CEU and Bufau and organisations like that. And whilst this is not a sort of ultimately the goal is they're both stratigraphic modes of recording, and the real differences between them are linked really about how and when you start to group and to order your stratigraphy. I think that's glossing over years of debate, I think, in a nutshell. And really, I think this highlighted to me and Keith the fact that whilst recording practices on site are quite well documented, actually what goes off site and how people actually go about analysing and organising the stratigraphy are not particularly, we're not actually that transparent about it, and there is some variation, I think, in off-site post-ex method. It's a bit of a dark art. Debate, discuss. Perhaps there's another question for the group, maybe. But Keith, next slide, please. So my recent, I mean, I have a background in London archaeology as well, amongst other places, and I've worked internationally too, so I've been exposed to a wide variety of strange recording systems. Most recently, I've been linked to the Çatalhöyük research project as well, where we have a strange sort of hybrid system. It's basically a single context system that cherry picks aspects of the sort of Carver-esque feature group approach to bring in some of the sort of more reflexive aspects of grouping in the field and so on and so forth. I won't go over, I mean, most of you are familiar with Çatalhöyük. It's a Neolithic site in Turkey. It's a fantastic site, but I don't think we need to dwell on that here. So next slide, please. At Çatalhöyük, we have a series of post-ex or a series of different types of sort of stratigraphic entity, I suppose. So we've got the unit at the base level, which is synonymous with context, really, as in single context. And then we, instead of having what most people call strat groups, we adopt these sort of Carver-esque features, which are very problematic when you're computationalizing your strat for various reasons that we don't necessarily need to go into here. But they're essentially a higher order spatio-temporal or spatio-functional grouping, and then we have phases and levels above that. And actually, what I don't note on here, but we'd also have buildings and structures too. So these are all, I hope, the kinds of entities that you may all be familiar with on some level, and you may have used either in London or outside of it if you've worked outside of there as well. Keith, next slide. And as you can see, and as Keith alluded to, I mean, our stratigraphic outputs are very similar to the Silbury Hill ones or to Dougie's ones that you noted from PCA, and they're very much linked. You know, they're built in Excel, and they're basically done through notation, and they're not coded. Eventually, as the project was digitized and the strat was checked and it was entered into the database as a series of this unit is above this unit and belongs to this feature and this phase and so on and so forth. But the raw data itself is essentially an Excel sheet, which is basically, it might as well be a hand drawing in the way that Keith was discussing. Go on, next slide, Keith. But my research was very much linked to how we can digitize that data and get more more out of it, I suppose. How do we bolt the sort of spatio and particularly the temporal aspects of stratigraphy back onto that spatial data using GIS? And it threw up lots of interesting spatiotemporal issues with how we jump computationally between the unit and then the space, the sort of localized building phases to levels and so on and so forth, sort of temporally and spatially as well. How you sort of navigate that sort of thing. Yes, thank you. That next slide, please. And also, I was quite interested in the fact that, you know, this is perhaps more than you probably need on most sites, but I'm quite interested also in how stratigraphic units have a lifespan of their own and how that could be modeled, and how changes in state, for example, in a wall, you know, it has a construction state, it has a use state, and then perhaps it's abandoned as well, and how that can be modeled and articulated into the stratigraphic archive potentially as well. Next slide, please. At Çatalhöyük and in my research, we've focused on using GIS as a tool for doing this. But that, and I suppose one of the sort of open questions really is, you know, do you use this? How widely is this used, you know, in the commercial sector, if at all? And what are the sort of implications of that? My own observations are that, you know, in order to do stratigraphic analysis or spatiotemporal analysis using the stratigraphy, there are certain affordances of the software that are a little bit problematic. So our field archaeologists either have to learn how to use GIS themselves and become a jack of all trades, so they have to diversify their own skill set, or they have to work very closely with GIS technicians, which means bringing another specialism actually into the field and the post-ex process, which is kind of fine. I guess we've all been doing this for years, and it's not different, no different perhaps from working with AutoCAD technicians to do phase plans as well. The difference with GIS is that it is quite a useful data management tool, a one-stop shop, if you like, for bringing all of the sort of spatial data and the other data under the same hood, and it does allow kind of a multi-scalar integrated approach to this sort of analysis, and of course it has all the same affordances as AutoCAD. It allows you to generate synthetic composite plans that are all coded and keyed up. So there are advantages to using GIS in this way, but in order to get stuff into the GIS, you have to be coding that strat data in a certain way. And so there is a sort of, it links back into, you know, how do you get that digital stratigraphic data in a way that's interoperable and that you can bring into the GIS. Next slide, please. I'm conscious that I don't want to overrun here. And I suppose the real question is why? Why do you want to do it? So of course, is it worth doing all this digital work on stratigraphy? And I think the sort of, in inverted commas, the Bayesian revolution, if you like, is one reason why. I mean, I know all the Bayesian people that Keith and I have mingled with, including Alex Bayliss and Caitlin Buck, are very interested in drilling down into and the interoperability of stratigraphy, because it's used to generate the sort of models and to do that kind of analysis, and it's been used to great effect. You know, if you look at what's going on in that world in terms of, you know, it's really rewriting prehistory in particular. Next slide. My own, and also I've been looking at this idea that you might be able to bolt other data into that spatiotemporal framework using the stratigraphy as well. So I was able to model stratigraphy to do sort of building, sort of visual biographies of buildings and look at the distribution of material culture through the building, through time. But again, only because I spent quite a lot of time making that strat into a digital format, which actually I realized I probably could have done quite quickly, quite easily, using tools like the ones that we're developing now. So I think that's it from me. It's just to sort of highlight the fact that there are good reasons for thinking along these lines if you want to do deeper analysis or make that stuff interoperable in the future. Right, Keith.
Thanks, James. I'll move on because I think we're getting through our time very quickly. So to give you a quick flavour, this was like some of the initial thoughts, feedback from the work. I mean, obviously we keep using these words: group, phase, period, and I just wanted this slide really just emphasise one of the references I'm working with the Bayesian chronological modelers, as I said, Caitlin Buck and Tom Dye, who's working out of Hawaii. They produced a paper together, which is very important. Some of the work I'm doing graph database work. But Tom makes this great statement: the terms period and phase are defined variously and sometimes interchangeably by archaeologists. He goes on to talk about a phase group in context of similar age, and a period groups phases similar age, yielding nested series of time loops. Now I've got Harris's matrix composer up here, and I looked in the help file, and while while they don't contradict each other, they do use the word phase and periods to mean, well, not in different, they use it different ways, and one needs to be able to actually semantically stick the two things together and understand the way in which they're using the terms. So when phases represent structural relations and period temporal relations, but we can make sense of that with the data, but we need to know that, or, you know, when people call a spade a turf inverted instrument, they're talking about the same thing. So just to summarize this sort of idea of that about digital data, one of the issues that I think we're finding with digital archives now, we spent 20 to 25 years being sure that we could actually keep the data digitally. And certainly in my early days of working in the mid-90s with ADS, the biggest challenges that people put towards us was, could you even keep this stuff on the computer anyway? And many people were very nervous about the idea that you would go for digital archives at all. I think we've crossed a bridge on that one in terms of how useful the digital archives are, and we want to be able to do that. But there's still questions about how much people put into the archive, whether, you know, slapping in 500 photos of mucky sections really is much use to anyone in the future. And they take up server space these days. There's actually a carbon footprint if you put more stuff on your servers. We do need data, though, that is fit for purpose for reuse, and matrix data needs, I'd say, to be a minimum a CSV file, not just a PDF document. PDF documents, fine if you want to look at the diagram while you're playing with the data, but it shouldn't be the only thing that's there. Otherwise, someone has got to key all the data back in. Recycling data, again, I mean, this is the question of trying how we could successfully reuse data and make data more available to other people. And I'm advocating something called FAIR principles. And there's a question that I've had discussions with Edward Harris. We just actually had a joint symposium at the Society of American Archaeologists conference last month. And we are considering whether there's a need for some sort of international convention on stratigraphic recording and documentation and methods, so that we can get, it's not that we need more standards, we just need to be able to sort of say that the standards we've got are actually talking about the same things. And there, if we then do that, then that ought to make the data more sustainable in a kind of these FAIR principles, which are advocating findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data. So coming on quickly, how long have we got? Wow, we're almost out of time. So what I wanted to do was mention this XSM10 Crossrail site, which Al Telfor, Serena, and Rob Hartle, they worked on, well, lots of people worked on, I'm sure, but the publications are out from Crossrail. And I came across these on ADS. I've been looking. My PhD student I mentioned, she spent several weeks going through ADS and working with the ADS staff to dig stuff out of their archives. And even then, we struggled to find comprehensive data from any project in the whole of the UK that had this data. And we have one project where we could actually get all the raw strat data and the analysis data and the phasing and put it all back together again. Well, there's two. I will be honest, Limo Peninsula Crossrail XRW10 as well. But to be frank, the only one with any real depth of stratigraphy across multi-phases was the XSM10. So that was good. It was in Stratify. We had to rebuild it. We have done that. But I wonder, my questions here for discussion are, is that, you know, one of the things that Al Telfor flagged was that if you're only making a matrix once a year, you know, once a site, or you may only do analysis once a year, and you then got to remember how to use the software. That's an issue. There are issues of how we get all the matrix on the screen. That's a big one, and we are challenged by that. There are maybe some people who still think it's better to do it on paper and permatrace. We saw Alex Bayliss with her multi-floor design paper all over Çatalhöyük, but I still don't think anyone's going to really argue that that is more effective than having it digitally. But maybe some people think Excel is adequate, and perhaps for certain sizes of site it is adequate. If you've only got a few, you know, 10, 50 contexts, you may not need a complicated strat software to deal with that. And so that question I'm asking the post-ex veterans, what do they think? Moving on quickly, what I want to do now, the last minutes we have, is to start to show you the software, which is not finished. So the crucial thing is, A, we're only about halfway through the development time. We have another year on the project till June next year. It's not intended to be fully functioning software for any kind of commercial use at the moment. What we're doing is a prototype so that we can show it to people like we're doing now and start to get feedback from people to say, actually, it would be better if it did that, or no, actually, I'm never going to use a piece of software to do this because it will just take me forever, or whatever. And the plan is to sort of spend the next few months getting feedback, making further conversations with people I've talked with already. We'll probably have a wider workshop in July for people across Mola, Wessex, Oxford, the 10 organisations I've already approached. And then perhaps talk to FAME about whether there is actually any potential for some kind of collective use of this software online. And then at this point, I'm just going to start running a few quick animated GIF versions of showing you, rather than try and show you the software, I'm going to give you the address here at the top. So that web address is now, you can, anyone who wants to go and look at this software can do so in their own time rather than try and do it live like this. But I'll show you, we've taken a dummy data set, that CTD, it basically stands for Crash Test Dummy Site. And I've actually been cheating, taken some of the data from what was XF10. The crucial thing is you have to have 5 fields in a CSV and you import it. And I'm just showing you here, having imported what is basically a set of 19 contexts, which is taken out of our Historic England recording manual, that section. You can see the contexts have gone in, it's got the strat relations, we're calling those the edges because they're the lines between the strat boxes. And it puts, first of all, when you first import the CSV, it'll just dump all the context into boxes, one on top of the other. You have to, first of all, unlock your phaser and then do the layout using some of the layout tools. You can see there's zoom, there's a lot of functionality in this which I haven't got time to show you now, and that's going to be for those who want to explore further. You use the zoom to fit, and then it'll fit however many contexts you have. You also have to be careful to relock your phaser so that you don't mess your diagram up. Another example, just for those that really don't have any idea when I say what CSV is, it's basically this. This is the data that's gone in. To make that diagram, that is all there is. There's 19 contexts, and you have to label the headings in the spreadsheet with the exact names that are in that file, which I've said there, just because that's the way the software works. Further examples here, I'll just show you we've got dating. We're prototyping the idea that you might want to include the dating as part of your analysis. So in this case, I've added a new piece of dating evidence. I'm going to call it, again, I stole this out of XSM10's clay pipe record. So we're going to put some more control vocabulary into the software, but for now you can just type in that it's a clay pipe and it will do so. If I'm talking faster than I can type. Once you've said what it is, you can say which context that piece of data evidence is in, and you can put some dates on it. In this case, as I say, I think this pipe was a long bowl type, which is about 1680 to 17 something or other. It'll tell me in a minute. There you go. And that's that one. An example of the phasing, again, obviously we're doing subgroup. We've modeled it on the idea that people will want to do, probably if you're going to use the software, you're going to have a complex enough site that you'll want to subgroup, group and phase. Just to give you a sense, the yellow boxes are showing you where are we on at the moment. Are those the groups? Yeah. And then it's highlighting the phases there. Again, there's various ways in which we're going to adapt this according to the phase. Effectively takes up all that space between the phase lines. I think that's enough of that one. Crucial thing to remember, if you do delve into this, make sure you save your work regularly. And what it does is it saves in what we call a JSON format, which is a JavaScript open notation web-based format, which allows you to then pick up your data. It saves it in a file, and I'm just showing you very quickly that it will put that file in your downloads on your PC, assuming you're using the PC software. The phaser download file sits in your downloads, and then you can put it anywhere you like after that. I mean, it will sit there on the machine safely. But if you go away from the phaser tool without saving, you will lose what you've done. So bear that in mind, be warned. And here, as a final slide, sort of getting to the end, I want to give you the link. I'll put this up and leave this up while the questions go on if you need to copy it down. We're basically following a sort of participatory design method as proposed by Professor Doug Tudor at South Wales University of South Wales. So we're opening it up for people to sort of play with and try and send feedback and suggest modifications, improvement. Crucial thing I will say at the moment is at this point where it says don't try and load more than about 500 contexts. You can do it, and you might find that you can do it, but it relies on basically on the quality of your broadband. So if you haven't got very fast broadband, you may sit there waiting for things to happen because you've put a lot of context in. But what I've also put up is a sample data set. So that example I showed with the 19 context in the CTD is available from the web link shown here. It's also up on the web page. So if you go to the web page, which I've put at the top, the project web page, you'll find this information. So you scroll down to the bottom of the web page, you can find the links there too. I may even give the links to Sarah to circulate as well if that's appropriate later on after this. And that, I think, has got us slightly over time. But there we go.
Was
Thank
great.
you.